Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the Leonard Pearlstein Gallery in the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University. Today my guest is Gary Shteyngart, author of 3 acclaimed novels, The Russian Debutante's Handbook, Absurdistan, and Super Sad True Love Story, and his latest book, a memoir entitled Little Failure. This is the first of a 2-episode interview. In this first episode, we'll talk about Gary Shteyngart's memoir and use it to discuss his life up through the publication of his first novel. In the second episode, we'll discuss his career as a writer and the events that ensued as his writing career developed. Gary Shteyngart, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Your voice on the page is so inimitable that I thought we should start with having you read a little section from your memoir.
Okie doke.
And this is a paragraph that describes a picture inside the memoir of you at a very young age.
Great. There is a photograph of me at 1 year and 10 months taken at a photo studio, wearing a pair of children's jogging pants with their outline of a cartoon bunny on one of the front pockets. I hold a phone in my hand. The photo studio is proud to exhibit this advanced Soviet technology, and I am getting ready to bawl. The look on my face is that of a mother in 1943 who just received a fateful telegram from the front. I am scared of the photo studio. I am scared of the telephone, scared of anything outside our apartment, scared of the people in their big fur hats, scared of the snow, scared of the cold, scared of the heat, scared of the ceiling fan at which I point one tragic finger and start weeping, scared of any height higher than my sickbed, scared of Uncle Electric Current. Why was I so scared of everything? I asked my mother nearly 40 years later. Because, she says, you were born a Jewish person.
So that's the frame, in a way, for this book. And you describe in it how your family came to this country. You were refuseniks, as the term was.
No,
Is that right?
we weren't
No.
refuseniks. No,
Yeah.
refuseniks were those that petitioned to leave the country and were denied. And
that's true, refuse, yeah.
Right, and they were stuck there,
yeah.
and they lost their jobs usually, and they were living in this kind of terrible limbo or purgatory. But we got permission to leave, so we just got right out of there.
So you were 7 years old when you arrived in this
That's
country.
right.
And you explained that you came to the U.S., but you had come to love Mother Russia, and you were brought, in a sense, here to become a Jew, and you had had no experience practicing Judaism or knowing Judaism. So there was a kind of cognitive dissonance there?
Sure. No, I mean, we grew up and we were, like all Soviet children, I wanted to join the Red Army and become a cosmonaut, although I had a terrible fear of heights, so that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. But I loved Lenin. The biggest statue of Lenin in Leningrad was right outside our window, and when I wasn't dying from asthma, I'd come out and hug his pedestal. And it was at age 5, my grandmother, who was a journalist for a newspaper in Leningrad, asked me to write a novel, and she paid me a slice of cheese for each page I wrote. So I got 100 slices of cheese for writing a novel called Lenin and His Magical Goose, which was all about Lenin meeting a talking goose and conquering Finland and creating a socialist revolution there. And then in the end of the book, Lenin eats the goose because the goose is a Menshevik. And I was obsessed with the Civil War. There's a picture of me at age 4 or 5 in my, sitting there in my Russian sailor's outfit, which all boys were required to wear, and reading this giant Talmudic-sized tome on the Revolution of 1917. So I was, as a 5-year-old, obsessed with this Menshevik-Bolshevik question. Those were different times, and what's interesting about the Soviet Union is that people were very well educated. The system was awful, but people sure knew a lot. So
you had an attachment, and that you were wrenched from that and put into a Jewish day school, from which you knew nothing. You didn't know the language, you didn't know the religion.
Right, I didn't know 2 languages, English and Russian, and Hebrew. So,
yeah. And you were plopped in there, and expected to manage, which in fact you did in your fashion. But But first, your name was changed, which I find interesting. Could you explain a little bit about that? Why was your name changed?
Well, we came in 1979, and the next year Reagan was elected, and the evil empire speech and all that stuff. There was a huge amount of hatred toward anything Russian or Soviet. And here I was as a kid dressed in this giant fur coat made out of some woodland animal and giant fur hat, and I spoke Russian only. And so my father sent me to Hebrew school thinking, now I'm going to experience the love of my fellow Jews, the kind of love he didn't have in Russia, which was very anti-Semitic. But the kids hated me because I was Russian. That was sort of the unexpected part. They didn't think of me as a fellow Jew. They thought of me as a commie, or there was all those movies, Red Dawn, Red Gerbil, Red Hamster, you know. So the kids were very much into thinking that I was a Russian. So I remember pretending to the kids that I wasn't even born in Leningrad, that I was born in East Berlin. So there I was in a Hebrew school trying to convince Jewish kids that I was a German. Yeah.
It had become fashionable to be a German, or
well,
more
better,
fashionable than being a
better
Russian.
than being Russian. Nothing was worse than being Russian. So that was the difficult part. You know, like all Russian Jews, my parents were very Republican. I was very Republican. So it didn't make any sense to me. Why would anyone hate me? You know, I just wanted to be an American so badly.
Your Russian name, first name was what?
It was Igor.
Igor, which also had other associations that weren't of the best.
Well, it was a Russian name, so we needed to get rid of it immediately. Sure, and it was also Frankenstein's assistant. So we changed the letters around. We got Gory. That didn't work so well either, so we made Gary, and Gary Cooper, for example, was well known by Russians.
I love the way you describe, I mean, it was not a pleasant circumstance, but the way you describe it is very amusing as well as upsetting, that you were bullied horrendously at this Orthodox Jewish day school by two groups, the darker, more aggressive Jewish kids from Israel and the lighter, happier ones from Great Neck. So this was quite an interesting group of antagonists, and you were able to thwart them, ultimately, through your writing.
Right.
Explain that.
Well, it was actually a conservative day school, but, you know, still pretty conservative. And that involved a lot of rabbis droning on in Hebrew about things that we had no idea about, you know. When you're 9 years old, the Talmud doesn't make that much sense to you, nor the Torah. And so I wrote a satire of the Torah called the Gemara, in which Exodus became Sexodus, you know, and things like that would sound great to an 11 or 12-year-old kid. And before that, I also wrote these science fiction novels, you know, like Invasion from Outer Space and The Challenge, and one of the substitute teachers was very nice, and she designated a part of the English period as Gary Novel Time, and that's when I would start reading. And so the kids loved it, and it didn't make me popular. I mean, you would have to have a lot of money to be popular, and a nice car, but it did sort of move me away from kids thinking I was just Russian, which is what I didn't want, and to thinking me as just this crazy writer.
I love the scene. It's a very moving scene where the teacher understood enough to put you in front of the room and have you read every day. It was almost sort of Scheherazade-like, where you enthralled the class and they wanted to hear more of your science fiction book. And it must have been so thrilling for a boy your age at that time to feel that you could mesmerize a classroom of otherwise difficult bullying kids.
Well, the good part was that, you know, I was very scared of talking in English because I had an accent for so long. And in writing, there's no accent on the page. I misspelled everything in sight and made a ton of mistakes, but it felt like I was taking possession of the English language for the first time I ever felt that way, because we only spoke Russian at home. It was a very tight-knit Russian family, and so for me, this was a huge step in just learning to wrap my tongue around the English language. And I remember practicing reading these things at home, and that really helped too.
There's another passage I'd like you to read. It's actually my favorite, perhaps because I identify in some strange way with it, where you describe going after school to your grandmother's house when you were still in elementary school.
Yes, yes.
And she would feed you American junk food, and you would watch television. And this was a novelty because in your own home you were fed farmer cheese and canned peaches, and there was no television on principle.
Right, on principle. My parents said that a television would just destroy my
Addle
intellectual
your
life.
brain,
Yeah.
yes.
And they were right, yeah.
And you thank them for it
And
now.
I do thank them for it now.
However, you loved this, and your grandmother, all she wanted was to please you.
Yeah.
So please describe this passage of being at your grandmother's house and what she would do.
Yes. At grandmother's house, life is different. Whilst I recline on a divan like a pasha, 3 hamburgers topped with coleslaw and mustard and a fart of ketchup are quickly brought to me. I eat them up with trembling hands as my grandmother peers turtle-like from behind the kitchen door, eyes wide with anxiety. "Are you still hungry, my favorite one?" she whispers. "Do you want more? I'll run to Queens Boulevard. I'll run to 108th Street. I'll run anywhere." "Run, Grandma, run!" And Grandma raises dust through central Queens, her arms straining under the weight of pepperoni pizza pies, greenish pickle slices, servelat smoked sausages from Misha and Monya's Russian gastronome, ridged potato chips covered in some kind of orange crud, mayonnaise-heavy tuna fish salad from the kosher store, thick pretzels that I pretend to smoke like cigars, ranch dips that bring to mind a hint of the garlic that's all but absent in our little net garden apartment, packets of creamy chocolatey ding-dongs, cartons of Sara Lee layer cake. I eat and eat, trans fats clogging my little body, pockets of fat popping up in unlikely places. Sometimes I find Grandma in the kitchen sucking on a chicken bone amid an orange landscape of government cheese while she leafs through a fresh packet of food stamps, each graced with a beautiful drawing of Philadelphia's Liberty Bell. Grandma survived the wartime evacuation of Leningrad with her 3-year-old son, my father, to suck poultry marrow in a Queen's kitchen, but she looks happy with her meager meal, philosophical. Anything to keep little Igor, or Gary as the Americans are now calling him, in ding-dongs.
That is so good.
Oh, thank you.
It combines the sublime and the ridiculous.
Yes.
I love it. You were then, after you finished your elementary education and middle school, you were then admitted to the most elite public school in Manhattan, Stuyvesant High School. And there you found a very different environment from the Jewish day school, and where you had been very easily one of the smartest in the Jewish day school. You weren't exactly one of the dumbest, but you were one of the least achieving at Stuyvesant.
Wasn't doing very well.
What happened?
Well, it's a math and science high school. In Hebrew school, I probably knew more Talmud than most of the kids at Stuyvesant, but I didn't know math and science all that well. And because I never really had to work hard, I mean, there were some other kids from Hebrew school at Stuyvesant, but they always had to work hard to achieve their grades, so they were used to the idea of, nose to the grindstone, but I sure wasn't.
Well, you describe the scene at Stuyvesant. Again, I'm going to ask you to read, and I want to prelude this by saying that you had, at this point, the unimpressive GPA of 82.33, and then you do this riff on the grade-obsessed Ivy League-driven kids at Stuyvesant, and I wonder if you would read that little description.
The schoolwork has always come easy for me. In Hebrew school, my competition was my best friend Jonathan, another friend David, the mighty Khan Caesar, and maybe 3 girls. At Stuyvesant, there are 2,800 children far more gifted than I am, half of them hailing from points east of Leningrad. In class, they are bent over their desks like so many human architect lamps, humming softly, insanely, to themselves the way Glenn Gould would hum over his piano, little pockets of drool shining on their chins, the corners of their eyes covered with the only sleep they'll ever know, their pencils assuredly making magic against their notebooks as equations are swiftly put to bed. What accounts for their commitment? Who is tending their home fires? What awaits them if they fail? I always thought my papa beat me too much, but what if he didn't beat me enough?
It's so good. Like little Glenn Gould's over there. Wonderful riff.
Thank you.
Despite your claim to relative doltishness at Stuyvesant, you seem to have learned a lot there. And one of the things you mentioned that you learned, or that you perhaps unlearned, were some of your prejudices.
Sure. I mean, like many immigrant communities, the Russian one definitely had a lot of racism. There was a lot of talk about blacks and Latinos, which I partly think, and this is my theory, is that you know, you give up your culture, your language, you feel lost in a country, you're looking for someone who you think is even worse off than you are, and then you wage, you know, philosophical war against them. That's what it felt like. But at Stuyvesant, which was an incredibly multicultural school, and to this day is even more multicultural, I think it's about 70% Asian students at this point. But there were brilliant kids from every, you know, corner of the world. And so the idea of, I mean, I think the biggest education I got at Stuyvesant was really just being introduced to Manhattan. Yeah. That's what it was there for. I never learned any math or science. But I found a cosmopolitan life. You know, that's not something I had growing up in the very furthest reaches of Queens, almost suburban-like. So for me, this is where life changed. I mean, theoretically, if I hadn't gone to this school, I wouldn't have become a writer. I probably would have been
a lawyer.
Oh, probably.
That was what your parents had in mind
sure,
for you.
I would have been a lawyer.
You went from Stuyvesant, and this, I guess, is part of what you're talking about, to Oberlin College, a very liberal, I guess, artistic sort of college, where you say you spent your time, if I may quote you, smoking pot, drinking beers of the world, and trying mostly unsuccessfully to have sex. Also, that your longest assignment was to watch Ridley Scott's Blade Runner and then write a paper describing your feelings about it. Now, this strikes me as rather an indictment of college life, and I wonder how the Oberlin marketing department would think about that. You also took a writing workshop at Oberlin that almost destroyed you as a writer, if I may understood it correctly. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, first of all, Oberlin had a wonderful professor, Diane Rules was her name, under whose tutelage I wrote my first book, or about half of it, and she was amazing. I couldn't have done it without her. But one year I think she had taken off, and there was another instructor, a woman who was a disciple of Gordon Lish, who is this famous editor. He edited Raymond Carver, and he has a method where you start, you know, in a workshop you usually read a little bit and then you discuss the work. But Gordon Lish's method is that as soon as he hears one word that's false, he says stop, and then you move on to the next person. And so class would last a couple of minutes because, you know, she would say, no, that's false. And then we would all go out for beers and pizza, which was the nice part of it. But so many people I knew who were taking that course just stopped being writers altogether because they said, well, I'm not a good writer. And she did write me letters, her comments on my work saying, you know, you're the best writer in the class because you know grammar a little bit, you know. So, but it was still,
demoralizing?
It was demoralizing, and it taught me that, you know, I teach writing at Columbia University now. One has to be really careful with young people. I was already writing the stuff that, you know, would soon be published, but if you just stick to one style of writing and you don't like other styles of writing and you inflict that on your students, you're going to destroy many a career.
When you got out of college, you went into psychoanalysis. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what propels you to, I mean, it's not therapy, this is psychoanalysis, this is 4 days a week.
I had a friend who was a kind of mentor to me. Most people discouraged, you know, I felt a lot of discouragement from becoming a writer. I was rejected by the University of Iowa's famous writing program, and I thought, okay, that's it. I gotta quit. But he encouraged me to continue with my first novel. But I wasn't much of a good friend to him, and I didn't like taking criticism from him. He was giving me a lot of it. He was also a writer. He was giving me advice on the book. And he at one point just gave me an ultimatum. He wrote me a beautiful letter, which is partly reproduced in this book, about the many reasons why I should be in some kind of analysis. And I took his advice, and that's when things began to turn around for me. In a year, I had applied to another program with Chang-Rae Lee, who's a writer who I deeply admired. He was doing stuff with immigrant fiction that I wanted to do myself. And 2 weeks after that, he got me a book deal. So things worked very quickly.
So, but getting the psychoanalysis, do you feel that opened things up for you? Was there really a turning point in terms of what it made you see about yourself that helped you as a writer?
Well, not just as a writer. I mean,
as a person.
Yeah. I mean, at that point, I was dating a woman who 2 years later would be convicted of hammering a guy who looked just like me taken off his ear and sentenced to prison. You know, I had
so you were making bad choices.
Bad choices all around. My relationship with my parents was very difficult because I always thought that I had to become a lawyer to please them. And just follow the kind of life that they wanted for me. I was too scared to send my novel out. So all of these things changed within a matter of a year or two. And before I knew it, the book was out, it was getting good reviews, and I felt completely different about myself. I had become a different person very quickly.
You mentioned it briefly, but I want you to go in a little more depth because it's almost like it sounds like a novel where you were admitted, you said that you were rejected from the Iowa Writers Workshop, but then you were admitted to the Cornell writing program, which is a prestigious program.
Yes, very prestigious.
And you were ecstatic. And then you were admitted to this new, less prestigious program at Hunter College, which was directed by the writer Shang-Rae Lee, who you admired. But still, this was a new program. And you were placed in this was a dilemma. Of sorts, and then you met with Shang-Rae Lee, and tell us about that.
Well, at first I was very sure that I would go to Cornell because it is a great program. It also offers a full stipend for all its students. And a part of me, thought, okay, maybe my parents will like me a little more because I'll get a degree from Cornell, which is an Ivy League school, which has always been their dream. So I was about to go, and I thought, okay, well, I'm very sad that I won't be studying with Shang-Rae Lee, but, Hunter... First of all, it would be more expensive because I would have to live in the city and et cetera, But then when he said, look, I think that this book is good enough to send to my editor at Penguin. And he did. And then I met with her a little bit later and she said, we can publish this.
So this title, Little Failure, which you do describe in the book as being the way you were referred to by your family. But there are so many ways to say something like that. It can be said with a great affection and with a great deal of irony, but clearly you took it, even though I think there was affection and irony in it, you took it straight.
Well,
to some extent.
I think the circumstances, if I remember correctly, were my mother was visiting me. I was working as a grants writer for a nonprofit organization, not making a lot of money, obviously. And trying to write on the side, and I was in my 20s after I graduated from Oberlin. And my mother wanted me very much to go to law school. I graduated with good grades from Oberlin. It made sense to go into a nice law school. And she was visiting me, and it was a 5-floor walk up on the Lower East Side, and this is when the Lower East Side was not the gentrified place it is. And it was 100 square feet, I think, the apartment, and it was a sloping floor. And there was a giant water bug, just walking around like it was my roommate. And she kind of looked around and said, failure, little failure is what, and which is what I felt like too, And I thought, well, it makes sense. I've failed in her eyes.
But always the idea of being a writer was what was your core self, what was driving you?
Yes, but the more years passed between Oberlin and the being getting those wonderful comments from professors there, the more it seemed like an impossible dream, and that would never come true.
Your first novel, The Russian Debutante's Handbook, you said you began it at Oberlin and then finished it while you were working at various jobs in New York, and then it was picked up surprisingly to you and became not only a critical but pretty much a popular bestseller. And that must have been absolutely a wonderful experience. Both the critical and the popular.
Well, it's interesting, and I was so used to failing and to a kind of criticism that I've always felt coming not just, from the moment I stepped foot on American soil, I was being criticized for being Russian, or there was always something wrong with me. I was always the outsider, and all of a sudden, these reviews are coming in, and Midge Gokakotani of the New York Times loves it, and so what I ended up doing was, amidst the, 30, 40, 50 great reviews, I started looking for a bad review. I really wanted, because that was a kind of reinforcement of what I believed about myself. So finally there was a bad review from the San Francisco Chronicle, and I thought, oh, okay, this must be the truth about the book.
So when you go back to this book, which is your first novel, and is so inventive and so full of energy and life, which all three of your novels are, it is really a tour de force.
Well, thank you.
Do you wonder about the fact that you had the wherewithal to, I know I read somewhere you said that you admire anyone who can write a novel.
Yes, absolutely.
And I understand that feeling too. It's so hard.
It's not easy.
And especially when you've had no positive, I mean, you had some at Oberlin, but after that, do you wonder at the fact that you were able to persist and get this book done, which, I mean, it's long, it's full of wonderful, clever riffs and twists and turns.
Well, it was actually fun to write, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, the life I was leading was not a happy one. I was quite single. I felt like I was failing my parents. I felt like I was, stuck in these jobs that weren't what I wanted to do. You know, they were just there to pay the rent so that I can work more on it. But when I went home and I picked up the computer, the laptop, and I started typing away, I felt that I was back in this place where I wanted to be, where I've been since I've been 5 years old and wrote that book for my grandma, you know. This is the only thing I was ever very good at. I worked as a paralegal for a while just to sort of test out the waters about, law school, and that was a disaster. So this was the only thing I knew I could be good at. And
So it was a joy to write, is what you're saying.
not always,
or an
but a lot of
escape.
it was definitely an escape, and it felt like, that sometimes, and I worked on it so assiduously that it felt like the world that I was describing in this book was more real than the world outside, which is a form of escapism too, because I didn't want to be in that world outside. I really bet the farm on this. I wanted everything. It was either, if this didn't happen, I don't know what would have happened to me if it wasn't published.
Well, we're going to return and talk about your other novels in the second part of this two-part series, but I want to thank you right now for joining us today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us at the Drexel interview.